Welcome, friends, to our class. You'll find this available on my Facebook and YouTube pages and IMCW's as well. And as always, I want to thank you for being part of this weekly gathering. I love it that we join together from so many places around the globe. And before introducing you to our guest for the evening, I'd like to begin with a few announcements. And the first is a reminder that each week you're invited to join for the Mindful Movement class that's before this class and the discussion groups that follow, and they follow immediately after the class. And you can find the links on tarabrock.com/class. Also a reminder that next Saturday, the 31st, we'll be having our community gathering. It's called Satsang, which is meditation and inquiry, where we look at questions that can bring alive your practice. So if you want to come, it really helps to save and reserve a spot ahead of time. This and all my virtual offerings are on tarabrock.com. Please also check imcw.org for live stream offerings made available by our local DC area teachers. And this week's Affinity group meetings are women, teen mindfulness group, teens of color mindfulness group. I also want to let you know that our New Year's retreat, it's online. Registration's open. It takes place December 27th to January 2nd. You'll find it on imcw.org. And there is a lottery for that one. We usually have a wait list. Finally, a reminder about Dharma, which means generosity, that all these teachings are offered freely, and your donations make a really big difference. So we appreciate $10 if you can offer it, more if you can to cover for those who can't. But whatever you can offer is really appreciated, and the links can be found in the description for this class. Okay, and now I'm really excited to introduce you to a dear friend, to a fellow meditation teacher, Kate Johnson. Kate is dedicated to social change and has worked with hundreds of business and nonprofit leaders supporting organizational transformation. She teaches all around the country, and she's one of our lead mentors in our meditation teacher training program. I also want you to know that she has a fantastic new book out. It's called Radical Friendship. Just the title. I want you to hear the rest of the title. 7 Ways to Love Yourself and Find Your People in an Unjust World. Beautiful. I read it. I love it. It's a high recommend. It's so relevant to our times. I know you'll enjoy the book, and I know you're going to love being with Kate this evening and gain much from her wisdom. So have a wonderful time. Namaste and blessings.
Hi, my name is Kate Johnson, and I'm delighted and honored and really thrilled to be here with you tonight and to be in conversation about the Buddha's teachings on liberation, the Third Noble Truth, and how we might deeply touch into our embodied knowing of what freedom feels like, how we might let that feeling help guide us to a vision of what freedom might look like for us, both as individuals and also as a society. And I want to begin with meditation and with a practice that I hope will highlight that quality of knowing freedom. So as you all know, every time we come to the meditation cushion, it's different. Sometimes we sit and immediately find peace and ease and a sense of well-being. Sometimes we come and it's like, have I ever meditated before? One might not be able to tell. And just to say that no matter how our meditation is, the Buddha assured us that we all have moments of liberation, even if we never meditate, that the mind literally couldn't take it if there weren't moments of freedom and release from clinging and suffering. And so, the task isn't to cultivate something that's not already there, but to notice what is already there and to bring it forth even more. So there's instructions on this in the Satipatthana Sutta, which many of you may be familiar with. If not, that's totally okay. It's the sutta in which the Buddha teaches the 4 foundations of mindfulness, really the mindfulness practice that's at the heart of most of our practice in the Insight tradition. And here's what he said about this practice of mindfulness. He said, "This is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of nibbana, liberation, namely the practice of mindfulness." Right? So that's a beautiful promise. More than just stress reduction, right? The surmounting of sorrow and lamentation. I've certainly had some of that this week. I don't know about you. The disappearance of pain and grief, which we may be experiencing personally as well as a society. Some of the heartbreaking losses we've had due to the pandemic and police violence and all of the things. And for the realization of nibbana, the idea that mindfulness meditation can actually help us to be more free. And so the Buddha offers, several different ways to practice mindfulness. One that we'll focus on today, of course, is the mindfulness of breathing practice, where we gather our awareness around the feeling of breathing, or if that doesn't feel good, around another body sensation. We gather and unify the attention there, and then rest the mind in such a way that the mind becomes kind of protected from its own rippling and ruffling, from the kind of winds of wanting and not wanting and pushing away or checking out, right? So there's this kind of shield that starts to form that protects the mind, that is gathered and collected and unified by paying attention to the feeling of breathing. And then we'll drop in from time to time a question that the Buddha also encourages us to ask. This is in the 3rd foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of mind. And here, I think the Buddha is really encouraging us to bring forth this quality of non-judgmental awareness that Jon Kabat-Zinn articulated in his definition of mindfulness. There's an attitude of mind that is just about knowing the quality of the mind clearly. And here's, a passage from this longer passage in which he encourages us to notice, the quality of the mind. He says that in order to abide contemplating mind as mind, the practitioner understands the surpassed mind as the surpassed mind, and the unsurpassed mind as the unsurpassed mind. They understand the concentrated mind as concentrated, and the unconcentrated mind as unconcentrated. They understand the liberated mind as liberated mind, and the unliberated mind as unliberated mind. Right? So it's not saying, analyze yourself if you find your mind is unliberated, or beat yourself up, but just to know, in certain moments we might bring attention to the mind and say, hey, is the mind liberated or unliberated right now? Another way to say this that I'll suggest in the practice is the mind caught or is the mind free? And just to look at that, not only what's occurring in the mind, but the relationship that's unfolding between the mind and whatever it's noticing. And to inquire into whether it's a bound relationship or a freed relationship. It does a couple of things. One, it encourages us not to miss the moments of liberation. I think that in meditation practice, I don't know if this is true for you, but certainly for me, I can start to focus on the ways in which the mind's not quite there yet, or still wanders, or still gets, kind of caught up in its own projections. And so to be able to notice also those moments where the mind is either not caught at all, or after we notice the mind is caught and we let go, and there's this moment of space and ease and freedom. And if we notice those moments and reflect on them and attend to them, those moments will grow. We won't miss them, right? We'll record them. We'll imprint that experience into ourselves of knowing what freedom feels like, so that wherever it occurs, we can identify it. Like when you're learning to taste a new spice and you try it kind of full force, and then you can pick it up in different dishes. We're learning to pick up on freedom wherever we find it in our world or in ourselves or in our relationships. So we don't miss those moments of liberation. And when we attend to them, not only do we not miss them, but they start to grow. What we pay attention to grows. So that'll be our practice. I'll guide you in kind of setting you up, and I'll maybe offer a little bit more instruction towards the beginning of our practice session, and then towards the end, I'll let you practice a bit on your own with instructing yourself. And then afterwards, we'll continue our exploration of liberation and creativity. So if you haven't already, find yourself a comfortable place to sit or lie down. And allow your body to start to settle wherever it lands. Sensing into the density of the bones, the earth element of the body, and feeling the natural affinity that the earth element of the body has towards the earth. That it actually kind of likes to rest and sink in towards the feeling of being held by the big earth body. And you can close your eyes, or you can soften them slowly to the space in front of you. Either way is fine. But we're starting to draw our attention away from the visual field, where we get most of our information most of the day, and towards our inner experience of the body. And as we turn towards the body, just getting a sense in a general way of the landscape of the body and how it's oriented in space, drawing your attention to the lower part of the body where it's touching the floor, the cushion, the chair, the bed, whatever you're resting on. Feeling that sense of contact with what's supporting the body. And bringing awareness as well to the back of the body, back of the head and neck, shoulders. Back ribs, back of the waist and hips, pelvis. And also to the front of the body, the face, neck, front of neck, and the heart area, collarbones, belly, pelvis. And imagine that the front and back surfaces of the body expand away from one another, so the body has depth. Not trying to narrow the body in any way, but allowing it to really spread out and take up space. Releasing any holding that's easy to release. And also bringing awareness to the right side of the body, all the way from the right side of the head and face down through the right side of the neck, shoulder, arm, side of the chest and waist, hips, all the way down the right side of the leg. And then also the left side of the body, from the head, face, left side of the neck, left shoulder, arm and hand. And then from the left armpit down the left side, sweeping the awareness all the way down, from the armpit to the toe on the left side. And see if you can imagine as well the body taking up space from side to side. So the sides moving away from each other, expanding into its full horizontality. Lots of space. And also bring awareness to the top of the head, sensing the openness at the top of the head, and also the spaciousness, the vast spaciousness above the head, so that the body is connected to earth and connected to sky, and extending out in both of those directions, finding its full length, the natural dignity of the spine. And in this wide mandala of awareness, see if you can find the feeling of breathing, which has been happening all this time. So just a matter of tuning our attention to it, not needing to make it longer or shorter, or faster or slower. Taking the attitude that the breath is fine just as it is. And seeing if the breath has a quality that is soothing, calming. And if it does, it might be a good anchor for you, a good home base to rest your awareness. And if not, finding another place to rest your awareness that can be your anchor, your home base for today. Perhaps the feeling of the hands resting, or the lower body wherever it's resting on the floor. Some place where there's sensation that feels neutral or on the good side of neutral and steady. And as you gather the awareness there, perhaps even feeling into some appreciation for the ability to feel. Maybe even a bit of love for this body that is still feeling, still working, doing the best it can. It's certainly more easy to pay attention to something that we love. So if it's possible, letting yourself fall in love with the breath, or with the fact of your hands, or wherever else you're resting your attention. And allow those sensations, the pulsation, the vibration, the sense of fullness or emptiness or contact or flow, to fill up the space of your awareness, and allowing other experiences to just fade into the background. No need to struggle with them or push them away, but allowing them to recede as your awareness starts to fill with this experience of bodily sensation in the anchor, in the home base where you chose to rest for this practice. And just now noticing what the mind is noticing. It might still be at home in the anchor or the home base. Maybe paying attention to something else. So noticing what the mind is noticing, and then noticing the relationship of the mind to what it's noticing. Is it caught or is it free? Not judging, just collecting data. Noticing even how dropping in the question might shift the relationship of the mind to what it's noticing. And allowing that to happen if the mind starts to incline itself towards letting go, towards freedom. Noticing what that feels like. Letting your whole mind, your whole heart, every cell of your body absorb that experience. So that we can recognize it. And then having fully tasted that flavor of freedom, coming back to your anchor, your home base, resting the mind, gathering, collecting the attention, allowing it to become unified by staying in a moment-to-moment way with this experience of the anchor, receiving the sensations that are coming and going in a moment-to-moment way. Letting the mind rest and gather. The gathered mind is a protected mind, and the gathered mind is a powerful mind. And again, noticing what the mind is noticing, and knowing, understanding the relationship. Is the mind caught or is it free? And if there's any freedom here, even just now in this moment, drawing that forth, clarifying that experience, soaking in it. And then returning to your anchor, your home base, to rest the mind, gather, collect. steady. And again, noticing what the mind is noticing now. Dropping in the question, is the mind caught or is the mind free? And then inviting the mind to orient towards freedom, to incline towards letting go of what's caught. To incline towards a spacious kind of love. And then having felt that and registered that experience, coming again to rest in the feeling of your anchor. And again, just noticing what the mind is noticing. Is it at home? Is it away? And what's its relationship with what it's paying attention to? Is it caught? Is it fixed? Graspy, tight? Or is it free? And really letting yourself bask in what freedom feels like in relationship to what the mind's experiencing. And then taking that freedom back into your experience of your anchor, your home base, and resting the mind in a liberated way. And now in these last few moments of our practice, just inviting you into a contemplation of this freedom quality. And recalling any experiences of this spaciousness or lightness or ease that you might have experienced. And considering what it might be like to bring that quality more fully into your relationship with yourself, not just in meditation, but in everyday life. Feeling into and envisioning and imagining what that might be like. Notice even the places where it feels difficult to imagine being in a quality of freedom with some aspects of yourself, and seeing if you can keep trying to imagine anyway. And then starting to expand that contemplation to include your relationships with other people, your friends and neighbors and coworkers and other family members. And what would it be like to fully manifest this quality of freedom in your relationships with other people in your life? You can think first of those close to you. And then flash on the people that you maybe know but not so well, or see often but don't know. And then even a liberated experience with those who you may not like or disagree with in some ways. What might it be like to imagine manifesting this quality? And finally, imagining and feeling into what it might be like to be a part of a liberated society, enlightened society, the experience of collective liberation. And really stretching the mind to imagine that. Allowing the mind to become wild and bold and specific in its vision, collective freedom, enlightened society. And then go ahead and allow that contemplation to fade and come back to a more intimate knowing and relationship with the sensations of your own body at this moment, maybe taking a few deeper breaths. And as you do, if there's any person or group of people who come to mind who you'd like to share this experience of freedom with, do it now. Bring them to mind, open up your heart, and let it shine. So feel free to stretch your body out if you'd like, change positions. Congratulate yourself for a nice, juicy half hour of practice. And if there's anything that you want to note or write down about your experience and how you might describe what it feels like to be free, please take a moment to do that now. So this articulation of the existence of freedom and of the possibility of liberation comes to us in a familiar Buddhist teaching. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's the Four Noble Truths, and it is a teaching that seems to be common to every Buddhist tradition that I know of. And the truth of liberation is actually the third in a series. So these Four Noble Truths are an expression of the Buddha's wisdom and insight upon liberation, about how we get free. And it is stated in a series of cause and effect statements. So the first noble truth, that suffering exists, is stated as an effect, right? That there's an experience in every human life of suffering. And there's the kind of suffering that just comes with being a human being, like being born or giving birth, aging, illness, death, not getting what we want, getting what we don't want, losing people that we love. So these are human experiences that everyone who's embodied in a human experience gets. No one gets out of these things, no matter how much other stuff we have or how evolved we are. So we'll all experience suffering, and there's a way that there's a kind of suffering that comes with being human, and the kind of suffering that kind of adds on top of being a human being. And this, at the personal level, is it's caused by what the Buddha articulated in the second noble truth, which is that the cause of suffering that is adding on to the human experience, making it more painful, more difficult, is called tanha. And it means something like thirst. That's the most literal translation I've heard. We can think of it as a craving, a clinging, a holding on, being caught. And so there's a way in which we can, as individuals, harden around an experience that we don't like, or, forcefully try to push away what is not push awayable, or be so longing for our basic needs to be met that we end up taking more than we need. These are all examples of the kind of thirst or clinging or craving that leads to more suffering. And what's interesting about this is that when we look at the societal level, the places where the greatest clinging exists aren't always the places where suffering is experienced most. We can definitely see this with our current climate crisis, that the nations that are producing the highest carbon emissions and basically making a mess of this earth are experiencing climate change at a lesser level than some other places that are really not contributing as much to the problem. And so this is one of the ways that we can understand interdependence, that actually, if we imagine ourselves intermittently interwoven with other beings in this large fabric, then anywhere there's grabbing in the fabric, everything else gets pulled. And the good news comes in for this teaching in the third noble truth, which is that just like suffering exists, the Buddha says liberation exists, that freedom is real, that it is possible for us. And when we think about the practice that we just did, the kind of practice that in which we can experience liberation on this kind of granular moment-to-moment level, that kind of liberation is called in this text, in the Satipatthana Sutta, it's called Vimutam Chittam. It's a freed state of consciousness. And this is a temporary state, it's a temporary abatement of these experiences of suffering that can come either through a systematic meditation, which is what we just did, or through radical reflection. So there's those moments of freedom that we can experience by cultivating our minds, or by reflecting on the experience of the Four Noble Truths in our lives. And then there's the big liberation, which is what the Buddha is referring to in this third noble truth, called nibbana. And so this is a state in which greed, hatred, and delusion are fundamentally uprooted for good. And it's hard to imagine what this might be like on a personal level, but the Buddha does give us some words to describe it. And here's one of my favorite passages describing nibbana, liberation. It comes from the Samyutta Nikaya. The Buddha says it is the unformed, the unconditioned, the end, the truth, the other shore, the subtle, the everlasting, the invisible, the undiversified, peace, the deathless, the blessed, safety, the wonderful, the marvelous, purity, freedom, the island, the shelter, the refuge, the beyond. So for me, even just reading those words and hearing myself read them, I start to get a sense of, this collection of images or phrases or words, and the experience that they're pointing to, which is actually beyond language. But it's something that we can know for ourselves, and it's something that we can orient towards in a personal way. And when it comes to our society, when it comes to this idea of what might be a more collective liberation, I think we also have to get specific about what we mean. So I don't know what the everlasting or the refuge or the island might look like when we're talking about our society, but I think we can start to envision, what does it mean to have a liberated education system, or a housing system that is oriented towards freedom. So part of our creative challenge is that we have to know where we're going if we want to try to get there. And that is kind of what the fourth noble truth is all about. It's the truth of magga. It means a path, right? So if nibbana is the effect, then the cause of nibbana is the path towards nibbana. And part of why it's important for us to know really specifically and in detail what we're talking about when we talk about freedom is that how we envision freedom will help shape our path. And I believe that this articulation of liberation in its specificity is a fundamentally imaginative and creative act. We're orienting towards and describing and pointing ourselves towards an experience that we actually haven't experienced yet. And it reminds me of what an amazing activist and writer and thinker, Walida E. Marisha, wrote about all social change, that all social change is actually imagination, that it's in some ways an act of science fiction. And E. Marisha, along with another incredible theorist and facilitator of social change named Adrienne Maree Brown, collaborated to edit a volume that they called Octavia's Brood. It was an honor or homage in some ways to the famous science fiction writer Octavia Butler. And in this volume, they basically encouraged a whole bunch of social justice activists, some of whom were already writers, some of whom who had not written before, to write works of what they call visionary or creative fiction. And here's what Marisha said about that project and why they wanted activists and people who are articulating their vision of an enlightened society to write these works of fiction. She said, every time we imagine a world without borders, without prisons, that's science fiction. We have never seen that world, but we can't build something that we can't see. We absolutely need fantastical genres like science fiction, like fantasy, genres that not only allow us to step beyond the boundaries of what we are told is possible, but demand that we do. Demand that we engage our imaginations. Because all real, deep, substantive social change has been considered to be utterly unrealistic when it happened. And we need genres like these so that we can learn to start not with the question, what is a realistic change or win, but with the question, what is the world that we want to build? What is the world that we want to build? And so in terms of creativity and our practice, I think we're lucky in that there's already a relationship between Dharma and art in so many of our practices and in so many of the teachings of the more contemporary meditation masters and teachers. I grew up as an artist. I was I'm not a visual artist. I have to say, when I was in kindergarten, I remember we had a substitute teacher and I was coloring creatively. I was kind of going outside the lines in a workbook. And I remember her coming over and saying, "Oh, you're not a very good artist, are you?" And just being kind of crushed. I never considered that possibility that I wasn't good, but I was a good dancer, and I ended up pursuing dance until into my professional life, and went to a big dance conservatory in New York, and that's how I got to the East Coast from Chicago, where I grew up, and as I started to get deeper into dancing, I also started to get deeper into meditation and the Dharma. I started practicing just in yoga classes that I sought out to help alleviate some of the physical suffering I was experiencing as a result of dancing and the stress, really, of living in New York City. And then became really fell in love with the meditation practice. And at some point, I experienced a tension between my creative expression in dance, which felt very performative. It felt like I was, training my body to produce these virtuosic expressions and experiences for others. But I was aware that I wasn't, that my body and my inner experience was becoming more and more difficult to feel as a result of this obsession with how it looked. And then my meditation practice really helped me find the kind of width and depth of my own body and mind and heart again. And at some point I kind of flipped from, dancing all the time, being the kid that couldn't sit down, to suddenly being the person who just wanted to sit and sit and sit and sit in stillness and in silence. And I went on, multiple meditation retreats of 1 month, 2 months, 3 months in length, silent. And at some point on one of those retreats, I started longing to move again, but to find this integrated relationship between what I was learning about the importance of cultivating my mind and heart in the place from which I moved, and then the movement of a creative expression in dance or something else. I was open. So in order to pursue that possibility, I ended up signing up for an arts retreat in upstate New York with a teacher who became a teacher of mine for many years, named Arawana Hayashi. And she's an acharya in the Shambhala Buddhist lineage. And it was a life-altering experience because it wasn't a silent retreat. We did have periods of silence, but we also had periods where we integrated our practice with art making. So for example, one morning, Arowana had us go out and gather leaves and grasses and sticks so that we could make our own calligraphy brushes from the natural world. And when we arrived back in the practice space, it was set up with these long white scrolls of paper, and next to them, these bowls of thick black sumo ink. And she instructed us to sit down in front of the paper and put our brushes down that we had made next to the ink, and to sit in meditation and to feel and wait for when our hand, she said, became, she asked us to sit until our hand longed for the brush. And so I did. I sat and I thought, when is this going to happen? And lo and behold, out of nowhere at one moment, the hand starts tingling and there's a sense of desire. And so I go to reach for the brush and I'm holding it in my hand. And she says, okay, now wait and sit until the brush becomes thirsty for the ink. And so I did. I waited and then dipped, same thing, dipped the brush in the thick ink and started swirling it around. And that's how we made our art that week. We spent 90% of our time cultivating our mind state and heart state. And then 10% of the time making a kind of quick, fast, scribble of creativity that came out of that space of freshness and not knowing and curiosity and patience. And we did it with lots of different art forms. We did it with calligraphy. We did it with performance, with dance. We did it with large object arranging, kind of sculpture. And, I never did, or I have not yet, made it back into dance performance in the same way that I did earlier in my life. I hope someday that might happen, that integration of the meditation and the art practice becomes more unified. But what I did start to understand is that the deep relationship between creativity and imagination and freedom. I did start to understand what Arowana taught us, that not knowing and being willing to hover and relax in a state of not knowing is in some ways the very ground of our creativity. That real creativity sometimes means something coming from nothing, coming from the space, coming from the field, coming from our hearts. Coming from this interrelated social fabric in which we are all embedded. And I learned and remember especially a phrase that she offered us, that she quoted from her teacher, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who said that the role of the artist in society is to make enlightened society visible. I'll say it again. The role of the artist in society is to make enlightened society visible. And it's important to make it visible because if it's only in our minds, we can't see it, and other people can't see it too. So there's something about looking to the artists, the writers, the activists that I think we can really learn from, especially now as Buddhists or as practitioners of mindfulness, seekers of the truth. I don't know how you identify, but if you're here, I have a pretty good idea that you're also interested in a more enlightened society. And I think that we can learn a lot from the creatives who have already been working to make that society visible to us. I want to read you a passage that I love from the novelist Toni Morrison and her novel Beloved, that I think is an example of this making freedom visible, and also has some clues for us about what we need to do to make that happen. And it's a passage in which Baby Suggs, who's a kind of self-ordained minister, gathers the community of enslaved people on their day of rest in a clearing for praise. And here's what she writes. She says, "When the warm weather came, Baby Suggs, holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing. A wide open place, cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared that land in the first place. and in the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down, and then she shouted, "Let the children come!" And they ran from the trees towards her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. Then, "Let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and children see you dance," she told them, and the ground life shuddered under their feet. And finally, she called the women to her. "Cry," she told them, "for the living and the dead. Just cry." And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way, laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced. Women laughed. Children cried until, exhausted and riven, all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, baby Suggs, holy, offered up to them her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or go and sin no more. She did not tell them that they were the blessed of the earth, inheriting its meek, its glory bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, and that if they could not see it, they would not have it. Here, she said, here in this place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. So 2 things I want to lift up about this passage. One, this line, the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it. So again, this, exhortation to articulate and to envision, what can we see about freedom? What about grace? Can we imagine it so that we might be able to have it? And the other that I want to point out is something that a mentor and teacher, Rachel Bagby, the artist, the singer, says. She talks about how we might be able to practice freedom in unfree places. And that's one of the things that I think is so incredible about this passage, that even in the midst of enslavement, people were able to practice freedom. And that too requires great imagination. So I think that we can imagine a more enlightened society than the one we currently live in. And I know that for me, at least, it's actually quite vulnerable to talk about in specific terms what we mean by that. And in my experience, existing within systems of oppression and kind of rigid hierarchies of society has shaped what I believe is possible, what I can even think of and imagine. In some ways, the bar has gotten lower, and what used to be unacceptable has become acceptable. And so I think there's no time like the present to start to ask ourselves, if we were to start fresh, what is the world that we want to build? And one example of this is, I think, something that activists have been expressing for a long time, but I'm just starting to hear. And it's this call that really was refreshed this past spring after the tragic murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others, really. And that's the call to abolish the police. And when I first heard that phrase, I thought, what? How can we possibly do that? how could we, what would who would keep us safe then if we were living in a world without police? How would we address the violence and harm that we see in our society other than to, take the people that harm and put them somewhere, safe from the rest of us? And I started to envision something different only through the words of a abolitionist and activist named Mariame Kaba, who is from Chicago also, and who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that was called "Yes, We Literally Mean Abolish the Police." So I'm going to read a little bit from that essay, and in the spirit of kind of seeing what's happening and envisioning a more liberated relationship to it. She writes, "There is not a single era in United States history in which police were not a force of violence against Black people. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 17 and 1800s that caught and returned runaway slaves. In the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich. Everywhere, police have suppressed marginalized populations to protect the status quo. So when you see a police officer pressing his knee into a Black man's neck until he dies, that's the logical result of policing in America." And reading those words, I have to say, shocked me into a state of wakefulness. And this is not to say that police officers in general are bad, or that every individual police officer is a bad person. I know that there are amazing cops out there who are passionate about keeping our community safe. My cousin was one of them. He was a police officer all his life in the state of New York. He retired. Now he teaches criminal justice at a university. So it's not so much about individual cops and whether they're good or bad, or even individual police departments, but it's about re-envisioning a system that currently is very expensive and doesn't seem to be working at all, or seems to be working in a way it was designed, and it's a design we no longer want or need. And yet it can be hard to imagine what safety is like without a police. As I mentioned before, like, how do we deal with violence and harm other than prisons and policing? And yet we know that for so many of us, policing has made us less safe, not more safe. And you would think that if the policing system that we have really worked currently, then the neighborhoods that have the most police would be the safest, but it's actually the opposite. The neighborhoods that are the most heavily policed are the least safe in our country. And then, of course, we have the issue of police brutality towards Black people. And when I think about the fact that police officers could enter into someone's home without identifying themselves, and into Breonna Taylor's home without identifying themselves, and kill her, and not be held responsible for her death, I think we can do better. This is not the kind of world we want to build. And then in order to have a vision of a more enlightened society, we actually have to liberate our imaginations beyond everything we think we know, beyond what we think is a quote unquote realistic change or win, even beyond our wildest dreams about what's possible. And this is exactly what Mariame Kaba advocates. She writes a little further down in her essay, she writes, "People like me who want to abolish prisons and police have a vision of a different society, built on cooperation instead of individualism, on mutual aid instead of self-preservation. What would this country look like if it had billions of extra dollars to spend on housing and food and education for all? This change in society wouldn't happen immediately, but the protests show that many people are ready to embrace a different vision of safety and justice." So I don't know if Mariame Kaba considers herself an artist, but I know that her words and the words of other abolitionists, modern day abolitionists, have helped me to see something and envision something that I could not before they start to share what they can see. And this is part of what I mean by the activity that we can learn from in terms of creatively envisioning the third noble truth as it relates to our society as a whole. I want to read this passage from an essay that Arundhati Roy, the incredible Indian novelist and an activist, wrote. This is from an essay called War Talk that's become kind of famous. She says, "Our strategy should not be only to confront empire, but to deprive it of oxygen with our music, our art, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our sheer restlessness, and our ability to tell our own stories that are different from the ones we're brainwashed to believe. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." So if the role of the artist in society is to make enlightened society visible, I encourage us, each of us really, to consider what it is that is our art form. Miriam Kaba's, I think, is transformative justice, perhaps among other arts. Perhaps your art form is politics or business or education or parenting or friendship. So I think to take some time to feel into, what is our actual art form? What is our mechanism for making enlightened society visible? And then can we ask ourselves, what is the world that we want to build? And knowing that question can sometimes move us into a space of not knowing, and that not knowing is okay. That, as Erawana Hayashi said, not knowing is the ground of our creativity. And so with our practice, we can learn to orient ourselves towards what we know freedom feels like, that we can start to hover in the space of not knowing long enough for that vision of freedom to become clarified and specific. And so in our practice, we learn to stay open, to let it come, to be surprised, to listen deeply for the new world that is possible, and to let the sound of that new world breathing guide our next right moves. So I want to thank you, artists, for listening to this talk, for your kind attention. I wish you happiness, peace, and freedom, and I wish it for all of us. Thank you for your practice.